I think it's my pleasure in this session to continue this forewarned is forearmed, but to invite Clare Birgin to speak to us. In her 30-year or more career in foreign relations at the highest levels, she's had an emphasis on intelligence and security, as well as multilateral trade. Her experience as our ambassador overseas is extensive. In Hungary, Serbia, Kosovo, North Macedonia and Romania. It reminds me of what Winston Churchill said, that the Balkans have far too much history. And her publications I referred to in your program. Thank you, Clare.
Thank you very much, Mike, for those kind words. I just hope that I'm not referring to one of the same strategic appreciations as David referred to. I'm afraid there are a couple in here. Look, signals intelligence, or SIGINT, was probably the most important intelligence source for the United States and its allies during the Cold War. And Australia, although Australia was a junior partner, was directly involved. Nevertheless, signals intelligence in general, and ours in particular, especially in the Cold War, was often unknown or undervalued. Why? Well, there was the approach of the United Kingdom. In 1945, the British decided that for the time being at least, signals intelligence and deception would not be in the official histories of the Second World War, and it was nearly 30 years before Bletchley Park became generally known, beginning with Group Captain Frederick Winterbottom's Ultra Secret in 1974. And the author of the Official History of British Intelligence in the Second World War didn't cover the war in the Far East because this was mainly the concern of the United States. American historians did cover it, of course, and it was mainly as an American achievement. Australia hardly featured. But above all, there was no Australian official history of intelligence in the Second World War. Gavin Long, the general editor and author of 3 volumes of the Australian Second World War official history, left SIGINT out, apparently due to national security constraints. So by the time, does it sound funny? I sound funny anyway. So by the time of the Cold War, if we consider the Cold War to have begun in 1946, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. In the time of 1946 or 1947, and there's a question mark about that, which I'll return to in a minute. Australia's SIGINT story, impressive by any standards, simply hadn't been told. And it might seem as if Australia's Cold War SIGINT achievements were unknown because our powerful partners were determined, first of all, to keep their own SIGINT activities hidden, and then later on had their own legacies to consider and didn't care about ours, but that is only part of the truth. Australia learned SIGINT intelligence from the British. Where SIGINT was concerned, the British regarded Australians as one of us. We later benefited enormously from the United States technology and other assistance. And this was the inside story of deep trust and cooperation forged in wartime between SIGINT practitioners, which is alive today. The other side of the coin was the external political story. Australia was a junior partner, even as a participant in the 1947 UK-USA powerful SIGINT network, which became the Five Eyes. And because we were a junior partner, in the trade-off between the United Kingdom and the United States, our lack of autonomy was often painfully obvious. Justice Robert Marsden Hope may have had this in mind in some of his recommendations. The third report advocated a more independent approach for the Australian SIGINT agency, by then known as DSD. It said Australia's intelligence interests do not and cannot coincide with those of any other country. Therefore, although we can and should benefit from exchange of information and views with friends, we need our own intelligence collection and assessment capabilities. We also need constantly to reassess the benefits to Australia from intelligence relationships with other countries against the costs. And Hope's sixth report suggested that DSD could be more independent and ambitious in its operations. Hope recognised that participation in UK-USA was in Australia's interests, and therefore we should continue, but he also pointed out that the arrangement might not last forever, and that Australia might not always receive all the SIGINT that its partners possess. Therefore, he said, we should consider establishing some alternative resources which, while enhancing DSD's general SIGINT capability, would ensure Australia's access to SIGINT of critical importance to its security and well-being. We'll come back to these recommendations. When I first read them, I thought they were important, and that I also thought I couldn't have been the only person who thought so. However, I was unable to find at that time on the public record any debate on, or indeed any endorsement of them. I even asked people who had worked closely with Hope and was told only that the recommendations had probably been taken at face value, and that probably people thought that partners better than the UK and the United States were unlikely to come along. And in any case, they said it was clear from the history that since those Royal Commission reports, Australia had indeed developed and advanced an independent SIGINT capability while maintaining and strengthening our Five Eyes and other partnerships. I still thought it was strange that I couldn't find any debate or any kind of comment on these things. And I asked about it in different sentences, as you do when you're trying to find something out. But short of torture and blackmail, and they probably would have rung the police, I had to give up, so I left it for a while. After the Second World War, secrecy surrounding SIGINT increased. One reason was that the Second World War had proved the value of SIGINT as well as its fragility. And there was something else. From February 1943, the US Army's Signal Intelligence Service, with the assistance of British cryptanalysts, was running a top-secret program codenamed Venona to examine ciphered Soviet diplomatic telegrams. The program was so secret that even the American president and the CIA did not know about it. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, apparently resented the fact that the CIA was not under the authority of the Joint Chiefs, as the Office of Strategic Services had been. The coded Soviet cables, however, were very difficult to read because of a complex two-part deciphering system involving the unbreakable one-time pad. The US Army and British SIGINTers discovered that the messages, in the end they discovered that the messages were not between Soviet diplomats at all, but were in fact cables between professional intelligence field officers and the head of foreign intelligence of the KGB in Moscow. Venona revealed the size and hostility of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States, and that the Cold War had probably begun not after World War II, but much earlier. The Soviet attack, of course, extended beyond the United States and to its allies, including Australia. And we, unfortunately, had a reputation for poor security. It wasn't the Australian SIGINT practitioners who were responsible for leaks, I hasten to say, but others who were naive about Soviet intentions. Australia must have been seen by the Soviet Union as a soft target with access to the United States and United Kingdom secrets. Very few were briefed into Venona, but the imperative to keep SIGINT secret was such that SIGINT practitioners often developed a lifelong reluctance to talk about it. I have heard that Ralph Thompson, the first Australian head of the Defence Signals Bureau, never told his family what his job was. The Cold War was defined in, here we are, in the strategic basis of Australian defence policy, October 1956, as the continuing worldwide struggle between communism and the free world waged by all means short of international armed conflict. Australia was a willing participant in the struggle against communism, but our situation was complicated by the fact that the proxy wars into which we were drawn in the 50s, 60s and 70s were in our own region. Our Cold War opponents included armed members of the Communist Party of Malaya, and at the time of the confrontation, the Communist Party of Indonesia was a pillar of Sukarno's rule. In the case of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the communist governments involved had received formal SIGINT training from the Soviet Union. SIGINT thus became like the DNA or the genetic code of the Cold War. SIGINT has developed since the Cold War, but then it consisted of three separate but interrelated collection techniques: communications intelligence, comment, electronics intelligence, ELINT, and foreign instrumentation signals intelligence, or FISINT. There's also the equally important flip side, the protection of one's own secrets, known as communication security, or ComSec. The Cold War history of signals intelligence might seem drier than tales of British secret agents, but as those of you who have read Revealing Secrets would know, Australian signals intelligence in the Cold War is as fascinating as any. Throughout our SIGINT history, Australia has benefited disproportionately from the efforts of gifted individuals who understood our relationships with the United Kingdom and the United States, and who also recognised the value of an independent Australian SIGINT capability. Our book Revealing Secrets covers in some detail the salvage operation to rescue Australian wartime SIGINT from the demobilisation program of 1945 to 1947. From 1942 to 1945, SIGINT was a US-Australian combined endeavour with Australian Army and RAAF in Central Bureau in Brisbane supporting General MacArthur, and with the RAN in with the US Navy's Frumel entity in Melbourne supporting the US Navy in Hawaii and the 7th Fleet. The heroes were the Australian Lieutenant Colonels Alistair or Mick Sanford and Robert Little. Sanford rescued the world-class Australian codebreaker and Navy Captain Eric Nave from the bad politics of a clash with an American rival, which could have ended with Nave being sent off to unspecified research duties in London. Sanford and Little also rescued the small group of Australian code breakers who could break into enemy diplomatic communications. This diplomatic group, known as D Special Section, was removed from United States auspices by Little and Sanford to Australian Army headquarters at Victoria Barracks, St Kilda Road, Melbourne. Thanks to Sanford's and Little's efforts, in 1946, Australian Army field collection units were preserved. Similarly, RAAF preserved some wartime units which became 3 telecommunications unit at RAAF Pearce. The Navy preserved its wartime facilities near Darwin. Sanford and Little rescued what they could of the Australian elements of Central Bureau and moved them to Melbourne. An independent SIGINT capability didn't happen overnight, however. In 1946, a document entitled The Appreciation of the Strategical Position of Australia, endorsed by our Chiefs of Staff Committee and sent to the Prime Minister, said, Australia being an isolated continent with a small population, is unable to defend herself against a major power. It follows that a policy of isolation can only lead to disaster and that her security must be based on cooperation with other nations. So Brigadier Bertrand Coombs was commissioned to produce a report on joint intelligence organisation, and on the subject of SIGINT, he said the main point is that Australia must form part of an empire scheme. She cannot afford either to stand alone or be out of it altogether. The result was that on the 23rd of July 1946, the government approved a new peacetime Signal Intelligence Centre. It was given the anodyne cover name Defence Signals Bureau and established on the 1st of April 1947. As for the Australian Signals Directorate's predecessor, the Defence Signals Bureau, the United Kingdom offered to help set it up and provide its first director, Lieutenant Commander Polden. This appointment was a reminder that Australia was still a junior partner, but it ensured the best access to British intelligence. In due course, Polden was succeeded by the Australian Ralph Thompson, and years later, the 6th report of Hope's Royal Commission on Intelligence and Security noted that by excellent management, DSD had turned a potential weakness into a strength. Which brings me back actually to the insider's history of Australian SIGINT. He said that the twin constraints of specialisation and secrecy combined to develop in DSD a degree of exclusiveness and inward looking that could prove dangerous for morale. So far as I can tell, that has not been the effect on DSD's morale. On the contrary, the management has contrived to engender a strong feeling of esprit de corps based upon these same constraints. The specialisation and secrecy which created a cloistered environment within DSD extended to a wider circle of trusted SIGINT practitioners in Five Eyes partner countries. There were bumps in the road though. As I mentioned, the Venona program had revealed the extent of Soviet operations against the United States and that Australia was a target too. The British and Americans had been concerned during the Second World War about Australian security, and a leak from Canberra had been investigated. In 1947, under the Venona program, the British decrypted some KGB messages from the Soviet embassy in Canberra, which contained classified British military estimates. Our book describes how through 1948 and well into 1949, after the defeat of the Chifley government, there were restrictions on sharing classified American information with Australia, and David mentioned that also, I think. One would have expected these to extend to SIGINT in particular, but another insight into the inside story of Australian SIGINT and its practitioners, according to unattributable interviews cited by the historian Christopher Andrew, the exchange of SIGINT between DSB and NSA was unaffected by the restrictions imposed on other classified American information. Any exchange continuing unofficially or semi-officially, despite the degree of concern about security, would have been remarkable in itself. It seems that the SIGINT practitioners in DSB and NSA knew that they could trust one another and decided it should be business as usual. Full exchange was officially resumed with Australia in time for its participation in the Melbourne Tripartite Conference in 1953, after 3 years of Australians fighting alongside the United Kingdom and the United States in the Korean War. As for the United States, Korea had not been an intelligence priority at that time for them, and the US intelligence community was dismayed by the performance of their own SIGINT system in Korea. Along with its allies, the Australians experienced the effect of Soviet SIGINT training on communist signals intelligence in Southeast Asia. In mid-1951, all access to enemy communications was lost when the Soviet-trained North Koreans changed all their codes and ciphers to the unbreakable one-time pad cipher systems. Thus, for the last 2 years of the war, the United States and its allies had to rely on low-level voice intercept and traffic analysis for insights on enemy capabilities and intentions. Australia's commitments to troops to Korea obviously contributed to American willingness to form the ANZUS alliance in 1951. ANZUS was and is vitally important to us, but it lacked mutual defence clauses. Fortuitously, the UK-USA SIGINT network agreement signed by the United Kingdom and the United States in 1947, and in which we participate along with Canada and New Zealand, gave some reassurance much needed for what Alan Gingell called our fear of abandonment. UK-USA proved to be the basis for relationships of the utmost trust. Des Ball described it as the most important international agreement to which Australia is a party. The Korean War armistice allowed the redirection of Australian military forces. In the 1950s and 1960s, there were conflicts within and between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the remaining British possessions in Borneo. An Australian infantry battalion was sent to the British Commonwealth Far East Strategic Reserve, a British force with Australian and New Zealand attachments based largely in the Malayan Peninsula. From 1948, the Malayan emergency continued through to 1960. RAN operations incorporated embarked naval SIGINT personnel for the first time since their withdrawal from RAN cruisers in 1939. These specialists monitoring possible communist terrorist transmissions were sent to Singapore as part of Australia's commitment under the UK-USA agreement. Relationships, especially SIGINT relationships between the Commonwealth Division's forces in Korea and Malaya, became closer. And among the closest to their British counterparts were RAAF members. Between 1949 and 1985, RAAF telegraphists and signals operators worked in Hong Kong as integrated staff with the RAF SIGINT station, 367 Signals Unit and 121 Signal Squadron Detachment of the Australian Army. In the 1960s and 1970s, RAAF and Australian Army personnel intercepted Chinese military communications over the southeast sector of the Chinese mainland and across the South China Sea. DSB, by then known as the Defence Signals Directorate, was also involved in Project Kittiwake in the later 1970s, which, according to Desmond Ball, monitored Chinese satellite communications and telemetry from Chinese nuclear weapons, missile and satellite tests activities. And according to Christopher Andrew again, the Fraser government appears to have taken Hope's early warnings to heart. Prompted by proposals in 1977 for the ambitious Kittiwake project, which was also very expensive, and by allegations in the Prime Minister's Department that the SIGINT obtained from the People's Republic of China was of greater use to Britain and the United States than to Australia, the Fraser Cabinet instructed ONA to examine these claims. According to unattributable interviews, ONA reported that Australia was getting good value from the UK-USA agreement and gave its support to Project Kittiwake. SIGINT collaboration was also under the Fraser Cabinet's microscope when the Chinese invaded Vietnam in February 1979. According to Andrew, ministers complained that NSA had provided no SIGINT warning of the invasion itself, despite evidence from earlier SIGINT that it was imminent. The director of ONA reported that DSD was convinced that NSA passed to Australia all relevant messages and that the failure to provide warning of the invasion was due to a gap in SIGINT collection. Christopher Andrew notes that Fraser seems to have accepted ONA's positive assessment of UK-USA collaboration. If indeed the Fraser government was the first to examine seriously whether the UK-USA agreement gave value for money, far from calling into question the UK-USA SIGINT partnership, the revelations which followed strengthened confidence in it. Meanwhile, British secretiveness over the Suez crisis of late 1956 did not prevent expanding collaboration on SIGINT in the intercept stations in Hong Kong and also in Singapore. As for collaboration between NSA and GCHQ during this tense period, the historian John Ferris noted that they continued technical collaboration as the political clash took place above their heads. In the interests of saving time, with your indulgence, I'll move now to Vietnam, where the North Vietnamese, like the North Koreans, had received formal Soviet SIGINT training. So, for the first time since 1945, Australia sent to war a formation with a full complement of arms and services, including 2 specialist signals intelligence units, the 1st Divisional Intelligence Unit and 547 Signal Troop. The 1st Australian Task Force, 1ATF, was operating with greater autonomy than brigades in corps and army group campaigns in the Second World War and the Korean War. It was the first time since the Second World War that these intelligence units were supporting Australian rather than Allied forces. Despite lack of experience with SIGINT, planners and commanders included 547 Signal Troop, along with the 1st Divisional Intelligence Unit in the plans for deployment of the 1st Australian Task Force, 1ATF, in 1966. Raised specifically for Vietnam from the 7th Signals Regiment, 547 Signal Troop had 45 members for most of its time in Vietnam. Unlike its Allied counterparts, the troop included men with over 20 years' experience of SIGINT, including overseas deployments. They were professional and were held in very high regard. This was a good thing because the SIGINT prowess of their North Vietnamese opponents was not to be underestimated. In November 1950, the Vietnamese had sent their cryptographers to China for 6 months training, and later they had very extensive training in the Soviet Union. As a result, despite the far greater technological resources of their opponents, the North Vietnamese communications intelligence specialists had considerable success in both protecting Vietnamese communications and acquiring tactical and strategic secrets from ourselves. One of the most important contributions of SIGINT to the Australian Land Force campaign in Vietnam was shortly after 1ATF's arrival in 1966, when the Viet Cong had hoped for an early victory. They had mustered a large force, but the battle that followed at Long Tan disappointed the Viet Cong greatly. The Battle of Long Tan took place on the 18th of August 1966, as I'm sure you all know, but nearly 3 weeks before, 547 Signal Troop had picked up indicators of offensive action targeting the Australians. Radio schedules and intelligence indicated that they were in a rest and retraining cycle. Around the 29th of July, 275 Viet Cong Regiment started sending more traffic and longer messages. 547 Signal Troop had in fact located a much larger formation than expected from the North Vietnamese Army, which was using the Viet Cong division and regiments for its communications, but there was no way of knowing this at the time. The troop reported signs of increased enemy activity, but due to the secrecy surrounding SIGINT, although a sanitised version was passed to battalion commanders, they weren't told its source and they discounted it. At Long Tan, D Company, 6th Royal Australian Regiment encountered a much larger force. Vastly outnumbered, they fought heroically against enemies and won. After the battle, Australian and Allied staff officers began to pay more attention to SIGINT. Our book, Revealing Secrets, compares the Second World War SIGINT experience with the Vietnam War. During the Second World War, high-level code breaking of the Enigma, Lorentz and Purple machines had revealed the secret plans of the Axis forces, making it possible to forestall and counter their plans. In the Vietnam War, the inability to read high-level codes left SIGINT units and agencies with the tactical level communications. The effect was like not being able to see the wood for the trees. I mentioned at the beginning that there are those who believe that the Cold War began much earlier than the end of the Second World War. Similarly, while the Round Table talks in Poland, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the former Soviet Union signalled the Cold War's end, it was in fact ended over many years by an accumulation of people like Alexei Navalny serving prison terms and then suffering worse fates in the name of freedom of speech and human rights. Then there were the wars in which Australia served and in which SIGINT played a crucial part. We were involved in wars in support of our allies and against communism. As Australia moved from forward defence in the 70s towards the defence of Australia and greater self-reliance and focus on our own region, we didn't neglect our alliance relationships. Our historic Five Eyes SIGINT relationships are more important than ever. As we say in our book, even before being introduced to cryptography, Australians excelled at traffic analysis, using quick wits to make the difference between losing and winning a battle from the external characteristics of a message before they could read its content. Once introduced to cryptography, the best of the Australian practitioners were just as impressive. Cryptography can level the playing field between a superpower like the United States and a medium power like Australia, or indeed an impoverished country like North Vietnam at the time of the Vietnam War. Cryptography, like pure mathematics, is cerebral. The force of thought trumps wealth and power. In the Cold War, the nature of SIGINT enabled it to provide a vital hidden current of continuity, which compensated for the inevitable external changes in the governments of SIGINT partners and even serious disagreements between them. In the case of the Five Eyes partners, this continuity was reinforced by a common language, shared values and wartime experience. Unconfirmed but plausible reports of questioning of our SIGINT relationships have not weakened them. Healthy questioning has served our democracy well and is something Justice Hope would have been glad to see. Thank you.
We're in the fortunate position of having 5 minutes to interrogate our last two speakers. Are there any questions, please? On the other backs?
What proportion of analysis was devoted to enemy traffic, raw traffic? What proportion did that represent, rather than breaking into the crypto? In other words, isolating the provenance, the tempo of traffic, its time.
Do you mean traffic analysis?
Yes. What proportion is represented by traffic analysis?
Well, for Australians early on, it was a very high proportion because we were only introduced to cryptography quite late.
That's what I'm getting at. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot, but we were actually recognised as being the best at it, and that that the British, we have in the British secret history of signals intelligence that here Australians actually led the field, that we were very good at it.
The fellow, I think, who was responsible was Professor Trendall, University of Sydney, and he had a man under his command, formed a small group in Melbourne, linked with Frumell, Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne. But Trendall employed a fellow called Bond, no relation.
Bond, yes.
No relation. But Bond happened to be the vice principal of Scotch College, tried to teach me Latin and Roman history.
Oh, right.
I got to know him. Now, Bond was 15 when he matriculated to the University of Sydney. He taught languages.
Yep.
His long suit was maths.
I've heard of him, yes.
And that's
I've read about
the
him.
traffic
Very
analysis
impressive.
was developed principally, but Nave, who lived not far from both of them, was this connect.
He was world famous.
Oh,
Yeah, world
Eric.
famous. Yep.
Yeah.
That's great.
Another question up here.
Dave, thank you for your spirited address. Sorry to cut you short, the battery in the bell went off. Can you just, you painted a reasonably gloomy picture for that period of time. I guess I'm interested as to how were people being trained to do the sorts of things? Were there staff colleges? Were they being sent overseas? Was it you had to go to the right school, or was it just pure luck?
Yeah, so through the JIC, they have a part-time analytical staff who help them draft products. They're not trained until, I believe, training kicks in with the Army mid-50s. You get the intelligence training school set up. So on a service basis, quite late. I mentioned briefly the JIB, the Joint Intelligence Bureau. Now that's a non-military analysis agency. So they're looking at issues of common interest to the military services, things like industrial output, infrastructure. They have a training program from the get-go, and actually one of their early directors is a man who some of us will know is one of the directors of ACES, Cawthorne. He is a long-serving intelligence professional in the British Army in the Second World War. He runs training himself for his recruits. I believe that's 51, 52. And the JIB is really the locus of professionalisation within the community. The problem that they have is they don't have career prospects for their people. They have lots of people coming in. Some stick around because they're very interested in doing things like translating Indonesian comics. And others are trained up and then can't be promoted and get sick of it and leave. So there's a retention issue, which means that the training impact that does take place in the mid-50s, it doesn't have the effect that we'd like. And even as late as, from what I can tell, late 70s, this is post the JIC, this is with what was then known as the Joint Intelligence Organisation, JIO, they're still sending off their people to London to be trained in some niche areas.
Thank you.
I can add a comment to that if I may. As a former member of DSC myself, I can tell you that the training took place in-house, mostly courses within DSC. So you might not know anything about anything.
Yeah, I mean, that's an analytical, collection agency is a different matter altogether. Obviously, they're doing their own training from the get-go.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you join me in thanking our last two speakers?